All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, August 17th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the show here today, whether you are watching me live or listening or watching this back as a recording. Appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching our show, I know we get new viewers here every single day, which is amazing. This is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. We get questions in from our support email, support@sabersim.com. We get questions in through our Slack community, the Office Hours channel in Slack. And we, of course, get questions in live here on the show on YouTube chat. So I host this show live for a reason. I want to be getting questions as we're going along. I want you guys to add your 2 cents and your thoughts on certain things when we're talking about them. All that is great. If you have thoughts or have questions as we're moving along, pop them into YouTube chat or pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. That's the best 2 ways to do it here. Let's see. I think that's pretty much it. Oh, before we get started, I mentioned yesterday that we want to be doing a preview of our new redesign in later this week. So that is the plan for our strategy session this week. I think it might end up being Thursday. I'm not really sure exactly yet, but we want to show off the redesign. It's got a lot of new features, a lot of features that people have been asking for some time now. I've been mentioning in a lot of office hours recently, talking about certain topics where I say this is fixed or this is easier or possible in the redesign. So should be a lot coming. Jim just said dark mode. Yes, it's a little sneak peek there. Mostly excited to maybe surprise everyone that maybe isn't watching here yet or doesn't watch this video with that here on Thursday. But there is a featured dark mode in the new redesign. Pretty exciting stuff. I know that it does not surprise me at all that was the first thing that came up because that is a popular one. So all right, cool. So I see a few questions already starting to trickle in here in Slack and YouTube, so we'll get to everything today. I do have some good questions that came in via email, so I'm probably going to get started there. But see a few people are starting to join in. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. There was a small question that came in Slack from Kyle here about more on our content side. And he said, do you guys ever plan on producing live before lock shows or strategy shows for each slate? And Andrew responded and said that we don't normally like to tout plays of the day and that kind of thing. And that's true. But I do want to explain at least a little bit of just kind of why we do our show the way we do here, as opposed to touting or doing a live before lock show. There's a few things that I think live before lock and really like slate specific strategy shows miss. They miss context. It's kind of a tongue twister. Context, and also lineup context, right? Which are 2 very important things when you're making the decisions on what plays you like for that slate, right? If you're hosting a show or something like that, and the question comes in and it's like a 1v1, Aaron Judge or Juan Soto tonight, right? Most of the time, all anybody's doing to answer that question is go in here and say, okay, Soto, 10 points. Aaron Judge, 6.46. Okay, I picked Soto, right? Because that's the only way that you can really answer that question unless you know more information about the exact contest and what the rest of the lineup is around there, right? If you're playing a New York stack or something like that, or you got 3-4 New York bats in there, it makes more sense to correlate and go with Judge. If you're playing a bigger contest with a top heavier payout structure, maybe it makes sense to play the guy at lower ownership, right? But these shows where it's just like 10-second answers to these 1 versus 1 or 2 versus 2 picks or these touty type shows, just ignore all of that. So if you want to get an idea on what our favorite plays of the day are for a given slate, run a test build, right? And that's kind of the easiest way to do that. And it will allow you to, at the very least, be cognizant of the contest you're playing, right? Our favorite plays of the day in a 500-person single entry contest are going to be totally different than our favorite plays of the day in a 150 max 70 entry contest, right? So pick the contest you're playing, use the sliders, and build extra lineups, maybe build a nice big pool of lineups, and look at who you get the highest exposures to. And that test build is kind of what the plays that we would theoretically tout or might be our core plays on the day are. And that's kind of why the test build is such an important part of our process. That's why we always preach that. That's why we preach the importance of that. When you're sitting down and just trying to get an idea of what the slate looks like, run a test build on the contest that you're going to play, get familiar with what we think the best plays on the slate are given your particular contest, and go from there. We're always interested in continuing to improve our content mix. So if you have ideas or thoughts on, what the most effective kind of content would be for you guys, I think we are definitely open to that. But I think that just those shows are so common in the industry, and I don't think that actually at the end of the day helps people get very much better, because again, the questions and the kind of conversations that often come up with those things just miss the nuance of what the rest of the lineup looks like about the question, what the contest that person is playing looks like. And there's, even when you start to incorporate that kind of stuff, there's just a million different ways to build the right lineup, right? To attack the slate in the right way. So, but anyway, good question. We've got it before, and I just wanted to address that. So Kenneth is here for the first time. What's up, Kenneth? Welcome. Thank you for tuning in here. I've got a few questions, and Kenneth, I actually saw you had a question come in right before the show, so we will get to that here. I want to answer a couple that came in earlier here in our support channel. This one came in from Cole. And Cole said he was having some trouble. He said, I was using stack rules for MLB, setting it at 5 players in the same game at an exposure on 10%, but now it won't let me set a limit on the stack rule exposure. So I think what Cole was probably talking about, and maybe some of you guys have seen this before, is we did used to have an exposure drop down here in the stacking rules, where you could say to only use this stacking rule in a percentage of your lineups in the pool. I think this was causing a lot of confusion, first of all, because the max exposure here was working the same way it does here, which means it wasn't actually, if we wanted to build 20 lineups, for example, it wasn't actually setting a maximum exposure for your 20. It was setting a maximum exposure for your entire pool of 500 or so. So that was a point of confusion. And it's also a lot easier to mess with your stack exposures in step 3. So Cole, that is the way I would recommend doing this going forward. I'm going to remove the stacking rule, but say you run your 20 lineups or something like that, and you want, I'll just use 10% as you've got it here. Maybe you only want 10% of your lineups to have 5 stacks or something like that, or 5 stacks of a certain team. You can do that all here in the post-build process, and I think it's just much easier to work with. So we'll give this build a second to complete, and I'll show you what I mean. You may already be familiar with this anyway, but yeah, I know at one point that max exposure was there in the manual stacking rules, and I think it was just causing more confusion and not necessarily always playing very nicely with the stacks here on step 3. So it was removed. But we will go ahead and take a look. And it should just in general be quite a bit easier to work directly with your stacks here. So say you wanted to, maybe you want less San Diego, right? You can set a stacking rule like that. I don't know exactly what you were trying to do here, but maybe if you're only trying to have 10% of any one team as a 5 stack, right? We've accomplished that here. You could also, if we reset here, limit directly your stack types. So if you only want 10% of each 5 stack kind of rule, you can go in and set 10% and do something like this. That would also work. So part of the reason we build extra lineups here, 500 lineups when you've only asked for 20, is to make it very easy to do these kinds of things without having to build additional lineups. So you can see, right, I'm changing this to 10. It's limiting our stack exposure to the 5-3 stack type and now the 5-2 stack type by finding the best lineups in our pool of 500 that meet the required exposures that you've put here. So that is the way I would recommend doing that. If you've got any follow-up questions there, or if you are trying to accomplish something that I didn't totally hit on here, just follow up in the email that I send back to you. Happy to talk about this a little bit more, but this is the easiest way to work directly with your stack exposures and get the lineups that you want. So, but great question. Let me go ahead and keep us rolling here. Again, there were a few other questions that came in that I think are good ones. So wanted to pull up this question. This is from Chase, and this is something that we've talked about a bunch, and I think it's worth reviewing this. So Chase said, in a sport like baseball where correlation is important for the research build, Is it right to keep the correlation slider where it should be for a default 20 max build, or should I turn correlation slider off for my optimal players research build? So just for the viewers here or the listeners that don't know really exactly what a research build is or what we're talking about here, we've mentioned before, I think it began in a strategy session a few weeks ago, but the idea of running builds at certain settings, rather than using these builds to actually end up becoming your lineups, you can use them to research the slate and in particular find low-owned, high-upside players. And the way you can typically do that, I think most easiestly, most easily is by setting your ownership fade at 0, right? Turning the effects of ownership off and turning your smart diversity up to 10. And what this does is this allows you to get an idea of what optimal lineups might look like with single game simulations fueling the projections of every player when we build every lineup, right? Especially when you do this and build a lot of lineups at once, like 1,500, you can get an idea of how likely a player is to be optimal pretty quickly. But the question here is about what to do with the correlation slider, and it's a very good one, and I think I've answered this in a few different ways. And I think the best answer here is it depends on what you are attempting to accomplish. If you want to see stacks and you want to see the likelihood of a certain stack being optimal in your research, you need to keep the correlation slider on, because if you turn it off, you're not going to get any stacks, because the mathematical optimal using single game simulations for every game on the slate often isn't a stack. If you want to only purely look at the chances of a certain player being optimal, then you should turn correlation off, because when correlation is on, say, for example, on a slate like tonight, let's say Tatis, right, is probably the highest projected hitter on the slate, right? He is going, if you have correlation slider up, he is going to boost up the appearance of other Padres players in lineups and increase their overall exposure in your research builds because your correlation slider is up and he's correlated with those players. So you might overinflate somebody like Manny Machado or Cronenworth or Frazier's chances of being optimal plays because of Tatis's projection. But if you want to judge how good of a stack is San Diego compared to what the field thinks they are, then you need to leave correlation on so that you at least get those stacks showing up in your builds. So I think it really depends on how you want to do it. And I would say if you are researching purely from the standpoint of looking at stacks, or if you want to research your stacks, which is originally how we came up with this idea, right? This was supposed to be for researching this. This came from our video, Finding the Right Stacks in MLB DFS. And this was an idea about how to find low-owned upside stacks. It has become a little bit more than that, especially in the show here the past couple of weeks. We've been talking about that. But originally we used this as a tool to look at upside stacks. And I'll just go ahead and let this build, just so maybe it will provide something visual as an example so people can kind of realize what I am talking about. So again, while this is building, I'll kind of explain a little bit more about what this is doing, right? But we use play-by-play game simulations to determine our projections for our players, right? So when you see a projection for a player on step 1, that is an average of every single game simulation we have for that player. When you turn smart diversity to 10, it is going to build every single lineup by pulling out a single game simulation of every game using the players' projections they scored in that sim, and then building the lineup. And we're essentially going to get an idea of what optimal lineups could look like, what the highest scoring lineups could look like at the end of the night by building, well, telling the builder to build 150, but it's actually going to build 1,500 and viewing what a full set of 1,500 lineups looks like. We're getting an opportunity essentially to see if the slate played out 1,500 times, what is the percentage of the times that the right stack was this team, right? And that's what we're going to see in a second. But if you turn correlation off, it gets rid of the correlative effects completely. And you get an opportunity then to look at what is the percentage of the time a certain player is optimal. So it's very different, or not very different, but it's slightly different. And it just depends on what you are trying to do, really. I still think probably the most practical usage of this for the average player is going to be leaving correlation where it is at so that you can get stacks, so that you can research stacks. But if you want to look at hitters in a vacuum it will be easier to just turn correlation off for your research builds. But we'll give this just a couple more moments to finish up so we can talk about this a little bit more with some examples. Marcus just rolled up. What's up, Marcus? We're talking about the correlation slider in research builds here real quick, and get this done in a second here. But all right. I see a couple other people have asked some questions too. Chad popped a question into chat. We'll get to everything, guys. I promise I'm going to work through the questions in chronological order that I got them. So we're hitting some questions that came in our support inbox overnight to start here. But so we'll fill this to 1,500, right? And this is where it's very useful to look at stacks, right? Because we have stacks because our correlation slider was not 0. If our correlation slider was 0, the stacks would be almost incidental. You wouldn't really want to research this. You would want to research from the player standpoint, but you can see here, right? This is the most interesting information that you're going to get of running this build on these settings, is looking at the stacks, right? And then we can get an idea of what the ownership on the slate is going to be. Maybe we're comparing this to Vegas. Whoops, oh my goodness, not Vegas Golden Knights. It's not NHL season just yet here, but maybe we're coming in here and we're looking, right? This is how we typically do it. Okay, so maybe the field thinks the 2 best teams on the slate, or the top 3 or so, are Padres, Rockies, Dodgers. Toronto as a 4th, but SaberSim seems to think that Toronto is like essentially tied with San Diego as being the best overall slate. Maybe there's some upside there. Maybe Colorado is a fade. That seems to be a team that SaberSim thinks is a lot worse in terms of their expectation on the slate. Maybe we're looking at a team like Cleveland as a team that's going undervalued, right? These are the kinds of things we get out of this. Cleveland barely shows up in the top 8 team totals for Vegas, probably a team that's not going to garner a lot of ownership. SaberSim teams to think that they're the 5th best stack on the slate, right? Looking at this from the standpoint of stacks. But if we go over here to players and we make a statement that, Adam Frazier is the 2nd most likely to be optimal hitter on the slate, well, that might not actually be really true, because we have correlation on, and the impact of other batters being up here is causing his exposure in this build to increase, right? If we wanted to do a purely player-based, hitter-based analysis without looking at stacks, we would want to turn correlation off. So definitely kind of a little bit complicated there, a lot of moving parts. Chase, I don't know if you're here watching today. I know I see you in here every so often, but I'll make sure you get a link to this recording. Let me know if that helps walking through this. I think in general, it kind of depends on what you're trying to get out of this, right? And if you're unsure of what the best approach is, I think by far still the easiest way to use this is to leave correlation on. Do most of your research looking at pitchers, and also from the standpoint of looking at stacks rather than individual hitters, and going from that direction. So great question. And let me know if you have any follow-up questions here. So I want to jump over to this question because Kenneth, I saw you actually, you asked this in an email here, and then it just popped up in Slack just a few minutes later. So this was on my list of questions in email to answer. But the question was, if projected ownership is 3%, but my exposure to him is 11%, is that a good or a bad thing? Should I match my exposure to the field? So it is neither good nor bad. It is a statement basically on what you expect that player to do really compared to the field. So let's go back and look at our 20 max test build here, and we'll pull this up. You definitely, while this is going to load here, you definitely don't want to just match all of your exposure of every player in your pool to the field, because then you're really going to have no edge or no leverage, right? If any given player does well, you are simply going to have as many lineups as the rest of the field does with that player, and not really have a chance to gain or lose anything. Also, without playing really thousands of lineups, it is difficult to actually match your exposures precisely to the field for every single player in the pool, especially with just like 20 lineups or something like that. But really, I think you are on the right track by looking at your exposures compared to projected ownership. And it's really a way of thinking about what you stand to gain or lose in those lineups, depending on how the player ends up performing, right? let's go ahead and look at our pitchers because I think it's a little bit more straightforward. But we can see for a guy, for example, like Alek Manoah here, we are about twice the projected ownership compared to the field on Manoah at the moment, right? And what this essentially means is that, say, if Manoah ends up having a great game, maybe say he is an optimal pitcher, he's one of the top 2 pitchers on the night, we have twice as many lineups as the average person does in the field that have Manoah, and therefore stand to gain twice as much relative to the field, right? Compare that to somebody like Casey Mize, where we, even though we have lower overall absolute exposure to Casey Mize, we are 3 times as exposed to the field, assuming these projected ownership numbers are right, to Casey Mize, right? And our lineups stand to gain 3 times as much if Mize succeeds. Now, vice versa, if either of these players fail, we stand to lose more, right? We've invested into these players. So if Alek Manoah has a bad game or maybe has a floor type game, twice as many lineups compared to the average lineup in the field, twice as many of our lineups compared to the lineups in the field are going to suffer or are going to kind of lose compared to average, right? That's going to disproportionately hurt us. We can look at this from the exact opposite direction as well and look at a player that's going to be highly owned that we are maybe underweight on. I guess we could talk about Alcantara. That works, right? But maybe let's just go ahead and say we're like this, right? Let's just go ahead and say we had capped Corbin Burnes or something like that at 10%. So now 35% of the lineups in the field are going to have Corbin Burnes, but only 10% of our lineups do. So if Corbin Burnes now fails, we have basically the 65% of the field is going to be left alive, really, because they didn't roster Burnes, but 90% of our lineups are going to be left alive, is a way to think about that, right? We are underweight on Burnes in that case, and our lineups stand to gain when Burnes fails, right? So it is essentially a game of determining what is the player's likelihood of, the way I like to think about this at least, is what is the likelihood of a player being optimal or being the best play at their position, really, versus how much the field is likely to own that player. And if the field is undervaluing the player's likelihood of being optimal, it makes sense to be over-invested compared to the field on that player. And if the field is overvaluing that player's chance of being the optimal play, it is better to be underweight compared to the projected ownership in your exposures. So that's kind of like a quick crash course on thinking about exposures. Of course, it is worth mentioning here that one of the biggest advantages of SaberSim is that you can, because we build a large pool, I mentioned this at the start of the show as well, but because we build a larger pool than you actually ask for in your lineups, you can experiment and play with this all live in step 3 without having to build additional lineups. So you can do things like experiment with what just completely fading the most chalky player on the slate looks like, or perhaps locking in a player that your research is leading to you to believe is being heavily undervalued by the field or something like that. That's not what I meant to do, but maybe something like that. Or something like along those lines, right? So you can do this all live here in step 3 without having to build additional lineups. So coming around full circle here, being over or underexposed to certain players is not a good or a bad thing necessarily. You are essentially making a statement that the field in your particular contest size is undervaluing that player's chance of being optimal for that particular contest. So, but we can I could feel like I could continue to go in a little bit deeper there, but I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to be overwhelming here. But if you are still watching, don't know if you've stayed on here with me, Kenneth, but let me know if you have any follow-up questions there. But great question. So, all right. Let's see. I think that covers questions that in some capacity came in here through support before the show. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and get caught up here with some of these questions that have come in through YouTube chat, and we'll hit everything. So stick around if you've asked a question. I'll make sure I get to it all here. But I think first question we had right from the start, Jim said, I did what James said to review, but it wasn't right, or else the projections never got close to 1%. I'm sure I did something wrong. Interesting. So again, this is a carryover from another conversation we've been talking a lot about in stream here. While this is loading, I'll just say the idea behind this is checking your progress, or not progress, but checking your results from the standpoint of looking at your top 1% equity in your entire lineup pool, right? So let's go see if we can find a big build from yesterday. I'm sure there is one here. But the idea being that the average player, 1% of their lineups are going to be in the top 1% in the contest, right? But if you have 3% of your lineups in the top 1%, you are outperforming your expectation, right? Pretty kind of simple concept here. But so the idea, and Jim, I guess what the idea of what I'm hearing from you here is that you went through and checked this and you didn't have any lineups in the top 1% comparatively. So we could look at something like this and expand to our full pool of 200 and say you looked at the contest you played last night and actually it could very much be something like this, right? Maybe the top 1% lineup was a score of 140, right? And we had 0, right? Like something like this. This can happen. And this is kind of what I was talking about yesterday of why this needs to be a process. This needs to be something you're doing over time. Because if the projections were just not, well, I don't want to say it. I don't want to say it necessarily in that way. If the variance hits you in a way that the lineups just weren't there, right? Like we stacked San Diego, Colorado, Houston, right? These weren't the teams that had top 1% outcomes last night. I think Houston did okay, but it was Tampa Bay, right? Tampa Bay is all the way down here, and it was Atlanta who's all the way down here. It's definitely possible that on a single slate sample, you could just whiff it, right? And there's also only 200 lineups in our pool here. If you have 1,500, you've got more lineups to have a top 1% outcome, right? But this can happen, and this doesn't necessarily mean you're doing, hold on. Sorry. I wasn't looking. I was looking at, okay. So yeah, so maybe the top 1% lineup was a like 160 or something like that. This can still happen. You can still have lineups that don't have the right pieces in your entire pool, and there are days that you're going to have 0. But as long as you're kind of going through this process, you are probably still doing it right. So, and just make sure you're calculating that top 1% correctly too. It should be 0.01 times the number of people in the contest. Whatever that number is, maybe it's 500 if you're playing a 50,000 person contest. Look what the score was of the 500 scoring lineup and compare that to your lineups from the day before, ranked by actual score, and see how many lineups you have over that top 1% line. And again, I mentioned it yesterday too. I think rather than finding that you are consistently you're like consistently outperforming your top 1% expectation, I think you're going to find that there are days that you are blowing away your top 1% expectation. And then a lot of days where you're having something like this, and that's totally fine. So James said, if you scroll through all the way down to page 5, sometimes that could have been your optimal. Just check all the pages. You don't have to do that. You can just sort by actual score here, and that's going to float your best actual scoring lineup all the way to the top. So you should be able to do this quickly. And then I saw Jim said that only played single entry yesterday, so I only had like seven lineups. Yeah, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is if you're only building 7 lineups, and let's just say you're using single entry sliders and you're building 7, I don't know how many it's going to build for you, but I think it's going to be only 100 here. And if you're only building 100, your average performance is just having a single lineup in the top 1%. If you have at least 2 lineups in the top 1%, okay, so it actually only built 70. So your average performance, actually, you wouldn't even expect to have a lineup in the top 1% here. If you even put a lineup in the top 1%, you outpaced your average, even from 70, right? Because 1% of 70 is 0.7. So having one single lineup that was in the top 1% in this would be good. That would be outperforming expectation. If you had 2, you would be very nearly tripling your expectation of top 1% lineups, right? And again, it's just an important thing to remember that you would be 3 times better than the field having 2 lineups in your entire pool of 70 that made it in the top 1%. Gives you an idea of kind of like the general variance of how hard these contests can be to win. And that's not even talking about your lineups in your 7 that you actually played. I'm talking about your lineups in your full pool of 70, right? So, yeah, with only 70 lineups in the pool, right? It's going to be you're definitely going to have a little bit more like swings and variance here. It's also just keep in mind too that like the randomness is going to have a greater impact because you have fewer lineups. Like okay, let me see. I just saw Jim said, I think I am misunderstanding. I thought this would show all the lineups, like all 70, and see if any were in the top 1%. Yeah, no, that's the idea. So when we sort by actual score, right, you could even expand this to 70 if you want. There. So now what this is doing is it's sorting all 70 lineups by your actual score. So not just the ones you entered. Yes, that is correct. So this is all 70 lineups in your pool sorted by actual score. So this is of your 70, this is your best overall scoring lineup. This is your second best. This is your third best, and so on. So, yeah, cool. Looks like we're on the same page here. So, all right, cool. I'm going to keep us rolling here. Let me see what other questions have trickled in here. I saw, Jim, you said you're going to try some 20 maxes out tonight. I think you will find that it is not as intimidating as it might seem when you're first getting started, right? And that's essentially, that's part of why SaberSim is built the way it is to allow people to take advantage of lowering your variance and the getting an opportunity to take more nuanced stands with players and stacks on the slate, all the nice things that come with MME without making it completely overwhelming and impossible to build winning lineups 20 or 150. So, let's see. Okay. So really good question here from Chad. Is it more efficient to eliminate players from the player pool before or after the lineup build? So, if you are dead set on eliminating players and you know that no matter what, you are not going to use lineups that have that player in them, it makes more sense to do this before the build. Let me go back to today's slate. Because what that is going to do, it means that when we build your set of lineups, your big pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups, none of those lineups will have that player in them. You'll have a much bigger pool from which to work with. So let's say, for example, right, let's go back to our build that we ran here at the start. Actually, let's go back to this one. But let's say we knew, for example, that we wanted to fade Corbin Burns, which is a player that is going to be chalky. The builder is probably going to use a lot of lineups with Burns in it. We can still, as we just saw earlier here, give me just a minute to let this refresh here. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself. Sometimes my voice starts getting ahead of what is actually on stream on screen. Oh, this isn't. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this was just our default 20 max build. So we can see here. Okay. Are we good? All right. So what I was saying is we could go in and just eliminate Corbin Burns very easily from our pool here. But what that is going to do is it means it's going to eliminate every lineup from our pool of 500 that includes Corbin Burns. So as we continue to dial in projections, or not projections, but as we continue to dial in exposure percentages, we are quickly limiting our availability of lineups before we're going to see a message that basically says that the builder can't find enough lineups and it needs to build more. So comparatively, or in contrast, I guess, if we knew we didn't want to play Burns at all, it would make more sense to just remove him from the pool in step one, start over with a new build, and get a fresh pool of 500 lineups, none of which had Corbin Burns in to start. So I would say if you are taking more moderate stances on certain players, I think maybe it makes more sense to adjust exposures in the post-build process. But if you know for a fact that you either want a player excluded from 100% of your lineups or locked in to 100% of your lineups, it makes a lot of sense to do that here on step one. So it will give you a better idea of, it will give you a better pool of lineups that better match the way that you want to attack the slate. So Chad, let me know if you're still hanging out here. Hope you are, but if that was helpful, happy to, yep, got the thumbs up from Chad, right on. So let's go ahead and keep it rolling here. James said, do you recommend using a PC, Mac, or does it not matter with respect to the value I get from SaberSim? More of a technical question, but I do use Mac. I don't think it matters. I've used the tool on both PCs and Macs before. Seems like it has been fast and quick and effective on both operating systems, so shouldn't matter too much there. But cool. Let's see. I did want to hit this question real quick because I saw this come in on Slack, so I'm going to jump to this real quick. And this is from Manny, and he said, hi Jordan, I'm sure you mentioned this before, but here we go. I play different entries, FanDuel. Do you make one lineup group, let's say for the 150 max entries, and use the same lineups in 3 max entries, singles, or do you make lineups for each one accordingly to the maximum number of entries allowed? And thanks for keeping these office hours. Great stuff. Yeah, I'm glad you are enjoying them. That's a really good question, and I have gotten that one before. I think there's a few different options here, and it depends on a few things. It depends, one, on your time and how much time you have to do this and how much time you want to invest. It also depends a bit on your process. But I will say, if you are going to do separate builds for each different entry limit or each different combination of different sliders or build types, you should be aware that it is going to increase the time that you are taking in your process, probably pretty dramatically, right? These builds don't take... These builds, especially up against lock, can take a little bit of time. If you are also very heavy on the exposure editing part of your process, if you spend a lot of time in step 3, like I do, it can take a lot of time to get all these dialed in, right? You run your 150 max build and you dial in all your exposures, and then you run your 20 max build and you've got to do it again, and you run your 3 max build and you've got to do it again. That may not be a very effective use of your time. If you are editing projections very heavily, or you do a lot of your work in your process on step 1 here, editing team totals, editing projections, editing ownership, getting all that dialed in, and don't really mess around with exposures a lot, it may not take that long to run those extra builds and build those lineups like that. I also think it's very interesting and very important to look at the overall sliders and see how they are changing, if at all. There can be a pretty significant difference of the way you would want to attack a single entry 500 person contest and a 150 max 100,000 person contest, right? You may want to think about running different builds for those contests, but there's not a very big difference between running a single entry and that's a 500 person contest and a even really I don't know 15,000, 25,000 person single entry, right? There's a little bit of difference in these sliders, but not something that's going to actually really give you pretty significant different lineups, right? And maybe you find a lineup setting in the middle between these two and save yourself a bit of time. I think a happy medium here, and something that I did for a long time, was to group all of my single entries and 3 maxes in one build and group all of my 20 maxes and all of my 150 maxes in one build. I found that those contests played very differently. What was required to build an effective lineup in those contests was very different in terms of how leveraged I wanted to be on the field. So I grouped those as 2 separate things and ran all of my single entries and 3 maxes. Sometimes it'd be like 15 different lineups in one build, and then all of my 150 maxes and 20 maxes in another. Sometimes it'd be like 190 or 210 different lineups or something like that. And that was somewhat manageable. At this point now, I'm actually just running everything in one build because I feel like the greatest use of my time that I have to apply in my process is spent editing the exposures, editing ownership, doing a lot of the research that I talk about here on the show a lot. And I just combine it all into one build, and I use my best overall lineup from that build in my single entry contests. That is what I have found is the process that works best for me. I would say in general, kind of coming around full circle here, if you have limited time, which we really all do, right? Nobody has infinite time to spend on DFS every day. I would say apply your time less on running more and extra builds to fit all of the different contests you're playing. Group your contests together in a way that makes some sense to you, whether it's grouping your single entries and 3 maxes together, whether it's grouping 20 and 150s, whether it's grouping everything together, whether it's grouping by entry size, maybe all of your contests above 25,000 entries you're grouping together, regardless of whether it's single entry or 20 max, or whatever, and apply the time that you have on your research and editing projections and editing exposures and things like that. I think that's a better use of your time. So let me know if that helps. I want to review this question and make sure that I've kind of, yeah, I think I've answered that question well. Again, I've tried a few different things here. It also, too, it depends a little bit on the sport. If something for like golf, if you want to, you got plenty of time for golf, right? The tee times are out on whatever they are, Tuesdays. Are our projections up? I know they came out last week kind of late, and I will make sure that these get up if they are not. But for golf, right, you've got like all week to get the lineups in. So if you want to build multiple builds for every different kind of slider types you're doing, okay, these are not up. I will make sure these get up because I know these were late last week. So I will make sure our golf projections get up. But similarly for, well, actually in reverse, right, like a sport like NBA, you're never going to have time to redo all those builds when news breaks. So if you're playing NBA, you got to come up with a faster approach because you can't keep up, right? Single entries, you have a build for single entry, you have a build for 3 max, you have a build for 20 max, and then Anthony Davis gets ruled out 5 minutes before lock. You've got like one shot to refresh all those builds. So I would say it can be a little bit sport dependent too, but very good question. And let me know if that helps or if you've got any more follow-up for me here. I'm going to go ahead and keep rolling through YouTube chat here. Getting caught up. I see there's a lot of conversation going on here in chat. That is awesome. Let me go ahead and see here. So Jim said if I'm changing min salary to 49,000 and max to 49.8 and putting min projection to 5, is it possible that I'm messing up the projections? I did that last night and lost horrendously. Lol. No, you're not. I wouldn't say you're messing anything up at all. I typically will do some kind of max salary limit too, at least on slates that are somewhat smaller. On a 15-game slate, I might not worry about it, but it's just a way to help ensure that your lineups are a little bit more unique. The chances of a lineup being optimal by salary are not what people think they are. Lineups are way more owned at maximum salary than they are likely to be optimal. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. Again, min projection at 5 as well is fine. You are basically just going to find yourself removing a handful of players that are typically batting on the worst teams at the bottom of the order. So you can see in this case, there are only 3 players. There are 3 Boston and New York bats playing in the game with the lowest totals on the slate, all hitting 8th or 9th. So I think our min projection is by default 4 to include those players, so they at least in the pool. But you are by no means ruining your build by putting a min projection there at like something like 5. And same thing with the max salary, right? Yes, I mean it is a chance that there may be a build at 5,000 salary that is like well leveraged and well correlated and well built for your contest, but there's no concerns with lowering that, especially in a sport like baseball or golf or high variance sports where the optimal often does not use this maximum salary. In a sport like NBA, a player's salary is much more correlative and much more lineup salary is much more correlated with fantasy points, right? You sacrifice fantasy points much quicker by lowering your maximum salary in NBA. Doesn't mean you can never do it, but you do sacrifice fantasy points much quicker. That's maybe a sport where I would be a little bit more cautious with that, but in baseball or golf, no problems with doing anything like that. So let's see. All right, I'm getting all caught up here now. Okay, another really good question from Kenneth here. How and when should I use percentiles? So we actually have a video that is written for this subject exactly that Andy recorded. So I will go ahead and pop that into the Slack channel as soon as I hop off here. But basically, and the answer here, and we're making some changes to percentiles with our visual update here coming out later this month, but we actually typically recommend that for most players to just leave this alone before their build for all purposes other than research, right? If you are interested to see, for example, how a player's 95th percentile, right? Essentially their top end ceiling, right? Their most highest possible points compares to their average projection. You can sometimes get some interesting things and find some players that potentially have much higher upside compared to what their average projection might indicate to you. For example, a player that is very much popping here to me right now is Vlad Gutierrez, who I believe a second ago was not showing up. Oh, okay. I mean, he was a little bit, but it is interesting here to me, right? And we see Yanoa drop and Gutierrez and Webb jump up when we look at a 95th percentile. And that might be because, is coming off the IL, hasn't played in a while, might have his upside limited. You can see he drops actually pretty far down when looking at 95th percentile, right? His upside is probably fairly low compared to what you might expect about his average projection, right? Who's another player? Chris Bassett is another one interesting, right? High salary guy here where maybe his average projection isn't that great because playing against the White Sox, right? Good hitting team, especially if they put out a good lineup. But he is a talented pitcher, gets a lot of strikeouts. And when we sort by his 95th percentile, you can see he starts to pop up as one of the higher upside pitchers on the slate, right? It can be useful to do that kind of research, but we actually typically recommend that most players just leave this off, or not off, but leave it on average for when they're actually running their builds. And the primary purpose of this is because smart diversity is essentially doing what percentiles are trying to do better, right? Smart diversity, I mentioned it here at the start of the show, is going to, the higher this number is, the smaller the size of the buckets of random game simulations we're going to use for each player when we build each single lineup. So the more diverse our lineups are going to get and the better optimized for upside our lineups are going to get, right? So yes, we could say build 150 lineups at the 95th percentile, but we're not really concerned overall with every player scoring their 95th percentile outcome. We want to get an actual random sampling of games that could actually happen and then use those for our projections when we're building lineups. And that's what smart diversity does. And that's why it's better. So all that said, I do think it can be interesting, again, as I mentioned, for research, for looking into players that have potentially higher upside potential. We also allow users to do this in step 3 if you want. So after your build, once this loads, you can see there's this little percentile here up here. And you can change this and look. And I think this can be useful from the standpoint of looking at it when you're asking yourself, like, what do I need out of this player? So for this lineup to hit, especially if you've been playing contests for a while, you can kind of start to get familiar with what kind of scores you need for a lineup to win, especially on like a 15 game slate. Do you need a 276 from your highest scoring lineup to win? Probably not. That seems a little high to me, even for something like the mini max. Maybe it's like an 85th percentile outcome. And I think this can be kind of interesting to look at from the standpoint of, like, what am I asking from certain players in these lineups? This seems like a little bit more like maybe a potentially winning score. And you can look at this and I don't know if you have some intuition about player scores or something, or it can be a little bit interesting to think about, this is what I'm kind of requiring of certain players for me to have the score I need. So is 32 realistic for Kyle Gibson? Maybe you could kind of use your intuition there. I don't know. Well, I think I removed Corbin Burns, which I think is why he's not showing up here. But that's kind of a few of the ways you can use percentiles. So we are actually changing percentiles in the redesign coming out later this month. It will still be showing up here, which is good. You can still change your percentile and update your projections in step 3, but we're making a change on step 1. And I actually think people are going to like this quite a bit. I enjoy this quite a bit. But instead of this being a drop down that you have to change and then wait for it to reload, actually every player percentile is just going to show up as its own column in detailed projections. So it will be like 25th percentile, 50th percentile, 75th, 85th, and so on. And you can just see that all in a column view, which makes it way easier to see. And it also is not so confusing for people about thinking like, am I supposed to be changing this? What do I change it to? And so on, because I know people get tripped up there. So, but good question. And again, it was kind of a summary of Andy's video on percentiles. I'm still going to post that in the Slack channel as soon as we hop off here, in case anyone wants to watch that. But that's kind of how I like to use mine. So, Kenna said my subscription started today. I'm so ready to rock. I love SS. Yeah, man, that's awesome. We're glad to have you. I host this stream here every single Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions as you're getting familiar, jump in here. ask questions. Highly recommend watching this every day, or even listening or watching the recording later, because I think there's some interesting conversations going on here every day on our stream. So, but all right, let's see. Another question just came in just after this one. This was from Jim. How late do you build your lineups? Yeah, another common question. For me, I wait until all the lineups are out, but I never start later than 30 minutes to lock. So I hope all the lineups are out 30 minutes to lock. If they're not, I start my process. I start getting lineups in. I will typically take that build and always enter those lineups in so that I know I at least have 30 minutes recent lineups. And if I get those lineups in and a new lineup card comes out, if I have the time and I want to make some adjustments, I will. Otherwise, I'll take advantage of SaberSim's late swap tool and just deal with that later with either a quick swap or a late swap to get players that aren't actually in that batting order out of my lineups. It also depends, obviously, on how many players I have on teams that don't have lineups in, especially with those late games. Say I end up playing a lot of Dodgers tonight, right? Big team total. And at 5 o'clock my time, that lineup card is not out yet. Or at half an hour to lock, the lineup card's not out yet. I'd go through, do my whole process, and then 15 minutes before lock, they put the lineup out. I might rebuild in that case, just since I have so many lineups invested in the Dodgers. I want the actual accurate lineup card in my lineups. But that's my typical advice I give to people for baseball, at least. Wait until all the lineups out. Don't wait until later than 30 minutes before lock to start, so you have plenty of time. Basketball, different beast, right? I would say definitely same deal. You probably need to start 30 minutes before lock, but you should know that you are almost always really going to be having to make updates right before lock as starting lineups come out and there are late scratches and things like that. So, but all right. Kenneth said 1 hour before lock, I make my lines. Yeah, that's fine too. It depends on your particular process, how much time you have. So 1 hour is fine. Let's see. So James said in this 20 entry jukebox, I had 6 in the green out of my 20. Where does that stand percentage wise? Yeah, I mean, the point of kind of the review mode thing is a little bit different because we're not looking at it from the standpoint of what percentage of your lineups are cashing. We're looking at it as what percentage. Well, okay, so this would be looking at what percent of the lineups you played cashed, right? Which isn't as much of what I'm kind of referring to here. I'm talking about what are the lineups in your entire pool that are top 1%, because I don't care about min cashing, right? You min cash, you just slow down the bleed, but we care about top 1%. So I think the idea here is instead of figuring out how many of your lineups are cashing, look at how many lineups in your entire pool that you built for yourself are in the top 1% of that contest. And that's an idea of really how likely you are to like long-term bink or come up with a lineup that is top 0.1%, right? So. But. Cool. I'm getting kind of caught up here. I see a bunch of other comments. It looks like there's been some interesting conversation here in chat today. But let me see. Question came in here. Do I have to have my entries into upload the main slate template for quick swap, late swap? I think you do. And I don't know. I've just experimented with this a little bit here before. Let me go ahead and get mine in here. But like, for example, so I don't have any entries in yet. I just have reserved contests. And I actually, so like, even if I fill, I still don't think it will actually let me late swap. Oh no, it will. No, yeah, see, it still thinks I only have one lineup. So I actually do think you at least need to download, enter the lineups. I'm not going to do that right now, but you need to download, enter the lineups, and then late swap to get them in, to actually use the late swap. But again, we've mentioned this before, right? You should really only be using late swap and quick swap once lock has already happened, right? If you want to swap your lineups now, just do a fresh build because none of the games have started. So, and by that point, you always will have your entries or your lineups in because lock has already passed. So, if it is before lock, run a fresh build, do a brand new build all your lineups. then refill using this. If it's after lock and you're swapping, then use late swap. So James said, yes, I believe you do. It's currently not working. Yeah, I do think you at least... Okay, so you have to press download, and then it's kind of treat this as... Now I can late swap the 20 lineups or whatever. But anyway, it still always makes sense to do a fresh new build if you are building before lock, because you get a bigger pool of lineups. You can do things like edit exposures a little more easy. All the nice features that come with building lineups with SaberSim, right? That you don't necessarily get with the late swapper. So, let's see. Really good question from Ryan here. And he said, do you think that CSGO is the biggest edge DFS sport SaberSim has projections for? If so, a lot of your volume should be going to that sport, especially for lower stakes players. I do think it's an interesting idea, right? We've talked a lot before about, I think that there's a huge difference between our Counter-Strike projections and anything else you can find out there, because we're not basing it on Vegas. Vegas has really soft, beatable lines for esports, and we are using, I think we'll set up a true skill model here, which is like a ELO variant that doesn't take into account Vegas and beats Vegas, right? So we have very sharp, very accurate Counter-Strike projections. I highly recommend people check this out, especially if they are playing at the lower stakes, because I do think there's a huge advantage, right? It is, while we believe that we have the best projections out there for any sport that we offer, it is easier to come up with a set of decent baseball projections, for example, because at the very least, Vegas is somewhat sharper, right, than they are with Counter-Strike, right? You could create a Vegas-based set of baseball projections and be decent and at least be somewhat in the ballpark. No pun intended. Actually, I guess pun intended. Or basketball, for example, right, is a very easily projectable sport. It's harder to kind of find your edge by just being better with your projections. But on Counter-Strike, the field is so bad with their projections that, yeah, I think there's a huge edge that you can find just by using them. I will say it is not a sport necessarily that you want to just hop right in here, press 20 lineups and enter them, right? There's some additional work you need to do. It is important to set a stacking rule, for example. I would say probably the maximum stack size at a bare minimum of a stack size of 3, setting this so that you are at least getting stacks, because you see we don't have correlation at the moment as a slider here. You also need to stay pretty tuned into the news, because there are regularly scratches of players. You need to stay pretty plugged into the lineups and know who is playing and keep an eye on that. I don't remember what else I was going to say. We had a strategy session recently. I'll pull this up on screen real quick. We talked about this the other day too. But one of our actual first strategy sessions now was about esports, and we had both Max and Will on, who built our League of Legends and Counter-Strike models, respectively. And that strategy session is here on our YouTube page. If you scroll down under strategy sessions and then scroll over a little bit to how to beat LoL and CSGO DFS, we had both those guys on talking about their tips about what they use to be successful at those esports, and some of the things that you need to know jumping into those sports. So I would say, yeah, I think there's a huge edge. I think there's an enormous edge. I think there's an edge that resembles the edge you would find in more traditional sports years ago, like 5 years ago, when nobody was even stacking in baseball DFS. I think Andy there's actually some language on the site that says like 5 years ago, knowing to stack in baseball was already enough edge, and it was. I feel like we are at that point in some ways with esports DFS where the field just has no idea what to do, and our projections are very good. And by using them, and setting stacking rules and paying attention and following, again, a few of the other tips that these guys talked about in this video, you can have a lot of success. So highly recommend it if you haven't checked it out already. I have been grinding baseball And before that, it was basketball. Hard. I've been playing a lot of slates, so it's something I want to add in to my contest mix, but I haven't really had time to dive deep into it. But I know a lot of the SaberSim guys just kill it here playing CSGO DFS, and that goes for League too. I think the field maybe is a little bit more tuned into League of Legends DFS. That might just be anecdotal from me. I don't know. I don't have a lot of data to back that up, but I feel like in general that the field is maybe a little bit sharper. I don't know. I don't know if Maverick's watching here today, but Mav would probably say that they're just as beatable. But that's kind of my gut feeling. But cool. Good question though, and I definitely recommend people checking them out. So, but. All right, cool. We are just at about the hour mark here. It has been another awesome show here today. We've talked about all kinds of stuff. What did we talk about here? We talked about correlation in research builds, more on our research builds kind of conversation that we've been having. We talked about a little bit more about our reviewing lineups for top 1% equity. I know that's been a pretty common theme here recently. We had a few new folks here joining the stream, so thank you for everybody that's watching here for the first time and asking questions. We had some great questions from Kenneth about percentiles and exposures, which was awesome. Chad asked about eliminating players from your pool pre or post build, which again is a great question. Good questions about when it is time to build your lineups and how many builds you should be doing based on what contests you're playing. I'm sure I am forgetting a few things, but I always kind of like to summarize and look back through everything we talked about. A little bit of esports there at the end, of course. So been an awesome show here again. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Jim said thanks for being here, man. Great. Good luck for everybody playing in the contest tonight. I think Tuesdays are probably one of the most fun days for baseball DFS because it seems like it's always a big 15-game slate. So enjoy the slate tonight. If you have questions for me while you are building your lineups, feel free to email us, support@sabersim.com, or alternatively, pop those questions into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we will get to them in tomorrow's show. Again, I will be back here 2 p.m. Eastern. So excited for that and look forward to a redesign preview coming later this week. I have my fingers crossed that we are going to host that on Thursday. I think that's looking good. We'll show off a bunch of the new features coming in the redesign. It is pretty freaking cool. So I think you guys are going to like it a lot. Excited to show it to everybody. But I guess until tomorrow, take care. I will see you guys later. See ya.